For German soldiers captured in the chaos of World War II, America was supposed to be a land of hostile enemies. They had been told, again and again, that across the Atlantic waited a monstrous society, corrupt, weak, decadent, poisoned by what the Reich called degenerate influences. In their minds, the United States was a caricature of disorder, a place where no true discipline or higher culture could survive. And yet, when the transports rolled to a stop, when the heavy doors slid open and the prisoners stepped out into a new world, the shock was immediate. It was not brutality that greeted them, not chains, not the silent hunger of captivity. Instead, it was something far stranger. In the hands of American guards, in the parcels delivered to the camps, in the small, modest libraries waiting behind the barbed wire, there were comic books. Thin, brightly colored volumes with exaggerated heroes, impossible villains, and adventures so fantastic they seemed almost like hallucinations. For men raised in a country where even laughter had been politicized, where every word was measured against the ideology of the Reich, the sight of such things was disorienting. Many prisoners could scarcely believe what they were seeing. Comics were not just entertainment in America. They were everywhere, woven into the fabric of ordinary life. And here, even for captured enemies, they were freely offered, as casually as bread or water. The Germans stared at them with suspicion. Some laughed bitterly, dismissing the crude drawings as proof of America's childishness. Others studied the pages silently, tracing the lines of the heroes in capes, the detectives in shadowed alleys, the cowboys riding across vast frontiers. Some did not even need to read the English captions. The images themselves told stories in a language older than words. To men who had grown up under the rigid censorship of Joseph Goebbels's propaganda ministry, the contrast was almost unbearable. In Germany, comics had been condemned as vulgar, un-German, a symptom of Western weakness. Here, they were not only tolerated, they flourished, shaping the imaginations of millions. And now, behind barbed wire, they had become an unlikely window into the American soul. Imagine the moment. A Wehrmacht corporal, captured in Tunisia, sitting cross-legged in the dust of an Arkansas camp, turning the pages of a Superman comic. On one panel, he sees his Führer mocked, reduced to a buffoon, the villain of a child's story. In another, he sees an invincible hero clad in blue and red, sworn to defend freedom, justice, and a way of life utterly alien to his own. His comrades gather around, half amused, half unsettled. Some shake their heads in disbelief, others whisper that it is dangerous to let such images into their minds. But the guards are indifferent. To them, comics are just part of America's abundance, cheap, plentiful, everywhere. And perhaps, in that indifference, lay the most powerful message of all. Because for the Germans, the question slowly began to form: what kind of nation defeats us in battle? And then lets us read this. In the smallest of things, the deepest shocks often lie. And for the prisoners of war scattered across the American heartland, comic books became the strangest revelation of captivity. The journey to America was itself a descent into the unknown. For most German prisoners, it began in the dusty corners of North Africa, where Rommel's once proud Africa Corps had crumbled under relentless Allied pressure. Captured in Tunisia or Libya, they were herded onto ships, packed into the holds, and sent across the Atlantic under heavy guard. The voyage was long, crowded, and filled with whispers. Some feared they would be paraded in chains down American streets. Others believed the rumors that they would be put to work in the mines or starved as revenge for the atrocities of the Reich. When the ships finally docked in ports like Norfolk, New York, or Boston, the prisoners were stunned. Instead of jeering mobs, they saw orderly docks, cranes swinging with cargo, American soldiers directing them with brisk efficiency. The men were lined up, searched, and sent by train deep into the heart of the country. Many of them had never been more than a few hundred miles from home. Now they peered through the barred train windows at endless stretches of farmland, at small towns where children waved as the convoys rolled past. The surprise deepened when they arrived at the camps. Set in places like Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, the compounds were ringed by barbed wire and wooden watchtowers, yes, but inside, the world was far different from what they expected. Rows of barracks, kitchens that smelled of fresh bread, recreational fields, even theaters. It was not freedom, but neither was it the brutal captivity they had been warned about. And then came the moment of first contact. When the prisoners were issued bedding, rations, and clothing, many also noticed something else. Tables stacked with American reading material, newspapers, magazines, and among them, comics. At first, the men thought it was a mistake. Why would the enemy offer entertainment to captives? Why allow tias, him to hold in their hands the very culture they had been told was poisonous? Accounts describe the disbelief of those first days. One prisoner recalled staring at the covers of American magazines, wondering if it was a trick. Another remembered the laughter when someone stumbled upon a Superman issue, its cover boldly showing the hero delivering a crushing blow to Hitler himself. "We thought it was a joke," he later admitted, until we saw more and more of them. The guards paid little attention. To them, providing such material was routine. It kept prisoners occupied, reduced tensions, and reflected a simple American assumption that even captives had the right to distraction, to imagination. For the Germans, however, it was nothing short of bewildering. Back home, soldiers were fed a strict diet of newspapers filled with victories that no longer existed, speeches that demanded loyalty, and books that reinforced the creed of the Reich. In America, they were being handed glossy pamphlets filled with impossible heroes, cosmic adventures, and villains so outlandish they made the Nazi leaders look almost small. That first contact with America was not on the battlefield. It was not even in the food or the barracks. It was in the bright, fragile pages of a comic book. And though many prisoners laughed it off, deep inside they felt the first tremors of doubt. Because if this was captivity, if this was how the enemy treated them, then what else had been a lie? To understand why German prisoners were so stunned by the presence of comics, we must first step back into the world they had left behind. In Nazi Germany, comics were not simply discouraged, they were condemned. Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, had made it clear. This kind of low entertainment was alien, corrupt, and dangerous. It was said to rot the mind, to distract the young from their duty to the fatherland. What did the regime offer in its place? A carefully curated cultural diet. German children grew up on militaristic stories, glorified biographies of Hitler and party leaders, and tales of Aryan heroes triumphing over shadowy enemies. The imagery was stern, cold, and disciplined. The purpose of culture was not to entertain, but to mold. Every book, every poster, every film had to serve the cause. Even laughter was policed, redirected into parody that ridiculed outsiders, Jews, or weak foreign nations. So imagine then the shock of a young German soldier, captured in North Africa, transported thousands of miles to a Texas camp, when he picked up his first American comic. On the cover, a brightly dressed man in blue and red soaring through the sky. Inside, wisecracking heroes, absurd villains, and adventures in distant galaxies or on the streets of New York. The tone was light, brash, almost irreverent. There were no speeches, no solemn declarations of loyalty. There was only imagination running wild. For the indoctrinated German mind, this was disorienting. How could a people who indulged in such childish fantasies possibly defeat the Wehrmacht, the most disciplined army in Europe? Some prisoners dismissed it outright, calling it proof of America's degeneracy. But others lingered on the pages, and quietly, the comparisons began. A diary from one prisoner, preserved after the war, described the first time he saw a Batman comic. "I did not know whether to laugh or to be afraid," he wrote. "This is not the Germany I was taught to believe in. This is something freer, stranger, more alive." Another remembered the unease of watching his comrades gathered around a comic strip, laughing at slapstick jokes or gasping at heroic battles. It felt dangerous, he confessed, as if we were glimpsing a forbidden world. And that is precisely what comics were, forbidden. Not because they were crude drawings, but because they symbolized something deeper, the freedom to imagine, to create without constraint. In Germany, such freedom had been stripped away. In America, it flourished, casually, even wastefully, thrown into the hands of prisoners as though it meant nothing. The shock, then, was not merely in the content of the comics. It was in what they represented, a culture so confident, so abundant, that even its frivolous creations carried a power the Reich could not replicate. Behind barbed wire, German prisoners found themselves face to face with the idea that imagination itself might be a weapon, and the more they read, the harder it became to dismiss. Life in the American POW camps followed a rhythm: roll call, work details, meals, long hours of idleness. For the guards, the greatest enemy inside the fences was not rebellion, but boredom. And so, almost without ceremony, they introduced something extraordinary: libraries. Each camp had one. Sometimes they were housed in a converted barracks, other times in small wooden shacks lined with shelves. Their contents came from many sources. Local communities donated books. Churches sent religious tracts. The Red Cross delivered parcels filled with novels, magazines, and, almost unbelievably, comics. In larger camps, the collections numbered in the thousands. German-language classics sat side by side with English detective novels and colorful stacks of pulp. The Red Cross played a central role. Determined to uphold the Geneva Convention, it ensured that even enemy prisoners had access to reading materials. Reports from the period describe boxes arriving with everything from dictionaries to Shakespeare. And tucked in among them, comic books: Superman, Captain Marvel, Flash Gordon. The cheap, flimsy paper seemed laughably out of place in a prison camp, yet it was those slim volumes that drew the most attention. At first, the Germans were hesitant. Many had been drilled to distrust anything that smelled of propaganda. But the guards did not force them. The comics simply sat there, free for the taking. Within weeks, the shelves were thin. Young soldiers, in particular, devoured them. Even those who struggled with English found meaning in the illustrations. A punch was a punch in any language. A cape was a cape. One camp commandant, in a letter home, remarked that the prisoners seemed as fascinated by our comics as by our cigarettes. Another recalled the strange sight of hardened veterans of North Africa leaning over a stack of comic strips, pointing at panels and laughing like skith, hool boys. The irony was sharp. Back in Germany, even children had been denied such entertainment. The Reich had banned Mickey Mouse as too American, too frivolous. Here, grown men, prisoners no less, were free to leaf through adventures the Nazi state had deemed poisonous. The lesson was unavoidable. America trusted its own culture enough to share it with enemies. Some prisoners began to use the camp libraries obsessively. They borrowed dictionaries to help them translate the comics into German, scribbling notes in the margins. Others collected issues, trading them like treasure, slipping them under mattresses as if they were contraband. But unlike in Germany, they were not contraband. The guards allowed it, sometimes even encouraged it, believing, correctly, that a prisoner with his nose in a comic was not a prisoner plotting escape. Over time, the camp libraries became more than just places of distraction. They were classrooms, they were windows, and for many POWs they were the first glimpse into a society that seemed almost impossible, a nation where even the most trivial, brightly colored stories were available to all, even to those behind the wire. In that abundance, in that casual generosity, the foundations of Nazi propaganda began to crack, because here was proof in ink and paper that America was not the caricature they had been told to hate. It was something stranger, stronger, and freer. Among the many titles that circulated through the camp libraries, none had the same impact as Superman. For German prisoners, This brightly colored hero in red and blue was more than a comic character. He was a direct affront to everything they had been taught to believe. Imagine the scene. A group of weary POWs seated on crude wooden benches, passing around a worn issue of Action Comics. On the cover, Superman is shown bending steel, smashing tanks, or flying into battle. Inside, the stories are even more provocative. There he is, punching Hitler squarely on the jaw. There he is, dismantling the machinery of Nazism with casual ease. For men who had marched under swastikas, who had sworn loyalty to the Führer, the sight was jarring. Some laughed. The absurdity of it, an American fantasy hero humiliating their leader in the pages of a child's magazine, was too much to take seriously. Others bristled with anger, muttering that it was an insult, a deliberate act of humiliation. And yet, even those who sneered could not look away. The images burned themselves into memory. Superman was not just a comic book hero, he was propaganda wrapped in entertainment, and he was effective. In Germany, the Führer was presented as untouchable, almost divine. His speeches filled the airwaves, his portrait hung in every classroom, his image loomed over every public building. To see him reduced to a cartoon villain, mocked and defeated by an imaginary strongman, struck at the very heart of Nazi mythology. There are testimonies that reveal how deeply this affected the prisoners. One recalled the discomfort of watching his comrades cheer as Superman threw caricatures of Hitler and Goering across the panels. "It felt wrong to laugh," he admitted, "and yet we laughed." Another wrote after the war that Superman made him realize for the first time that Hitler might not be invincible. If the Americans dared to mock him so openly, perhaps the Reich was not as strong as they claimed. The symbolism of Superman was powerful. He represented something the Nazi state had never allowed. A hero born not of the state, not of ideology, but of imagination. He was an immigrant's son, an alien outsider who chose to protect America not because he was forced to, but because he believed in justice. For the German POWs, this was more than confusing, it was destabilizing. In their world, loyalty was demanded, obedience was absolute. In Superman's world, freedom was the highest value. The irony was cruel and undeniable. Behind barbed wire, while stripped of their own freedom, the prisoners encountered a character who embodied it, and through him, they confronted a vision of America that Nazi propaganda had never prepared them for, a nation so confident in its power that it could turn even the war itself into a comic book adventure. By the time the guards collected the tattered issues and replaced them with new ones, the damage was already done. Superman had stepped into their minds, delivering blows not only to Hitler's image, but to the prisoners' faith in the myths they had been raised on. Captivity was, above all, monotonous. Days in the American camps stretched into weeks, weeks into months. Roll calls at dawn, work details in the fields, meals at fixed hours, lights out at night. The routine was strict but not brutal. Yet it was precisely that sameness, the endless repetition, that gnawed at the spirit. Prisoners who had once marched across deserts or fought in crumbling cities now found themselves idle, waiting for a war they could no longer influence. Into that void of boredom came the comic books. For many German POWs, they became more than just diversions, they were escapes. Between their fragile paper covers lay entire worlds beyond the fences. Cowboys galloped across the American frontier. Detectives prowled darkened city streets. Spaceships sailed through the stars. Superheroes soared above the clouds, unbound by gravity or barbed wire. It was in those moments, sitting on wooden bunks or stretched out in the grass inside the compounds, that the prisoners could momentarily forget where they were. A young infantryman might lose himself in the exploits of Captain Marvel, imagining himself flying far beyond the camp's watchtowers. Another might chuckle at the antics of comic strip tricksters, a laughter that felt forbidden but necessary. Even those who scoffed at the childish drawings sometimes found themselves flipping through the pages when no one was watching. Escapism served a deeper purpose. It softened despair. It filled the long silences of captivity with images, colors, and narratives that belonged to a world untouched by barbed wire. And for some, it became a coping mechanism. The war had ended for them personally the day they were captured, but in the comics, battles were still being fought, and won. Heroes still rose, villains still fell. It gave shape to the chaos of their own defeat. There are accounts of prisoners reading aloud to each, other translating panels into German, voices rising with excitement at the action scenes. One remembered how the younger POWs, especially those who had grown up too fast under Hitler's war machine, suddenly seemed like boys again when comics were passed around. "For an hour," he wrote, "we were no longer soldiers, no longer prisoners, we were simply readers." But escapism was not without its tensions. Some older officers frowned upon it, insisting that serious men should not waste time on nonsense. They preferred Goethe or military manuals, anything that kept their dignity intact. Yet even their disapproval revealed the quiet power of the comics, because what they truly feared was not the drawings, but the freedom of imagination they represented. Behind the wire, the greatest gift America had unwittingly given its captives was not food or clothing, but possibility, the chance to see beyond the immediate, to imagine a life different from the one prescribed by the Reich. The POWs were not just escaping boredom when they read those comics, they were, in a small but profound way, escaping ideology itself. And that escape would only deepen as they began to compare the culture they had known in Germany with the culture they were now absorbing in captivity. For the German prisoners, every page of an American comic was a reminder of contrast, of how different their world had been from the one that now surrounded them. It was not only the stories that startled them, but what those stories revealed about the society that created them. In Germany, culture had been a tool of the state. Literature was measured by its loyalty to the Reich. Films glorified sacrifice, obedience, conquest. Even children's stories were saturated with ideology, designed to harden rather than to entertain. The Hitler Youth had marched with songbooks, not comic strips. Imagination was disciplined, shackled, redirected toward war. America, by contrast, seemed almost anarchic in its abundance. To the POWs, comics represented a culture where creation burst forth without control. One issue might tell the story of a man in tights fighting Nazis, the next of a space explorer discovering distant planets, the next of a clownish detective bungling through a mystery. There was no single message, no central ideology. It was chaotic, sometimes silly, sometimes profound. But it was alive. And that contrast was unnerving. How could a people raised on such frivolity defeat the Reich, whose soldiers had been drilled into machines of discipline? Some prisoners clung to the old propaganda, insisting that America's victories were owed only to material abundance, factories, oil, and manpower, not to any cultural strength. Yet others, in quieter moments, began to sense that perhaps this chaotic energy was itself a kind of strength. A diary fragment from a POW in Texas captures the feeling well. In Germany, we were told that America was weak, but when I look at their books, their comics, I see something we do not have. They are free to imagine anything. We are not. Perhaps this is why they are winning. Even the imagery itself struck hard. American comics depicted women as independent, brave, adventurous. In Germany, the role of women in culture had been narrowed to mother, caretaker, symbol of fertility. To see women firing weapons alongside men or rescuing themselves instead of waiting to be saved felt foreign, even subversive. The cultural comparison extended beyond the pages. Guards casually shared jokes, referenced characters, or mentioned that their own children read the very same comics that now circulated in the camps. To the Germans, it was astonishing that the same society that fielded bombers and tanks also indulged in such lightheartedness and saw no contradiction in it. One officer sneered that America's cultural output was a child's dream. Yet that dream was precisely what made the most impression. The Reich demanded uniformity. America celebrated difference, even if it was messy, even if it was absurd. And in that difference, the POWs caught a glimpse of the vast gulf between the two nations. What they held in their hands was more than entertainment. It was a cultural mirror, one that reflected not just America's imagination, but also the poverty of their own. Behind the fences, with each new issue borrowed from the library, the comparison deepened, and the questions grew harder to ignore. By the time the war dragged into its final years, many German POWs in America had lived long enough behind barbed wire to recognize a slow but undeniable truth. The propaganda they had been fed in Germany was unraveling before their eyes, and nothing exposed this collapse more vividly than the very comic books they were handed. From the earliest days of the Third Reich, Nazi propaganda had painted America in harsh colors. It was, they said, a mongrel nation, ruled by Jews, corrupted by materialism, obsessed with trivial entertainments. Joseph Goebbels himself sneered that Americans were a people of jazz and comic strips, incapable of discipline or true greatness. In his narrative, a society that wasted its energy on such nonsense could never stand against the iron will of the Reich. But inside the POW camps, the Germans encountered the contradiction in ink and paper. They saw with their own eyes the trivial entertainments that their leaders mocked. And yet these very entertainments were everywhere, casual, abundant, and powerful. They were not a weakness, but an expression of confidence. The fact that the Americans could hand over comics to their enemies without fear of corruption was perhaps the most damning evidence of all. Prisoners began to whisper among themselves, if the propaganda had lied about this, what else had it lied about? They had been told America was starving, divided, desperate. Yet here they were, eating more meat and bread in captivity than they had in their own barracks back home. They had been told America's people were weak and disorganized, yet here they watched guards who joked easily, who spoke freely, who were not afraid of criticism. And in the comic books, the contradictions mounted. Superman mocked Hitler. Captain America fought the Axis with bold patriotism. But even beyond the war themes, there was something unsettling. Stories where justice triumphed without cruelty, where villains were defeated but not worshipped, where imagination leapt beyond politics entirely. It suggested a society not imprisoned by ideology, but driven by its own restless creativity. Some prisoners clung harder to their indoctrination, muttering that the comics were propaganda designed to humiliate them. Yet even that argument weakened with time. For every comic mocking the Reich, there were 10 others about cowboys, detectives, or aliens. If this was propaganda, it was sloppy and aimless. More likely, it was simply culture, messy, sprawling, indifferent to its readers' politics. That indifference was, in its own way, more powerful than propaganda. In Germany, the state watched every word. In America, the state seemed not to care if even its enemies laughed at its jokes or dreamed through its stories. For men raised under total control, the discovery was destabilizing. Letters smuggled back to Germany reflected the cracks. One POW wrote, "We are not treated as we were told. The Americans are strange, too strange. They laugh while fighting a war. They let us read anything, even mockery of our own leaders. I do not know what to believe anymore." This was the collapse, not with shouting, not with arguments, but with quiet, steady contradictions. Every comic borrowed, every meal eaten, every joke overheard chipped away at the wall of lies. And by the time the war ended, many prisoners had already crossed a line in their minds. They no longer believed in the world that propaganda had built for them. And the collapse was only deepened by what they saw next, the way American guards themselves engaged with the very comics the prisoners were discovering. If the German prisoners were bewildered by the stacks of comics available to them, their confusion deepened when they noticed something else. The guards themselves were reading them too. To a German soldier raised under the iron culture of the Third Reich, the sight was almost absurd. These men were supposed to be disciplined warriors of a mighty industrial power. And yet, during quiet hours on duty, American guards would sit back in their chairs, light a cigarette, and flip casually through the brightly colored pages of Captain Marvel Adventures or The Lone Ranger. At first, the POWs thought it was some kind of performance, a trick perhaps, meant to belittle them. But the longer they observed, the clearer it became. The Americans genuinely enjoyed these stories. They laughed at the jokes, argued over plot lines, and sometimes even traded issues with one another as eagerly as the prisoners did. For the Germans, this was incomprehensible. In their world, officers did not lower themselves to children's literature. Reading, when permitted at all, was for approved works of ideology or heavy classics. The idea that a man entrusted with guarding enemy combatants could also find joy in the antics of a costumed hero was foreign, alien even. And yet it was precisely that alien quality that gnawed at them. If these guards, with their rifles and uniforms, could still indulge in childish wonder without shame, what did it say about American strength? Perhaps the very thing they had been taught to despise, the culture of mass entertainment, was not weakness at all, but a kind of resilience. There are diary accounts from POWs describing this very revelation. One wrote, "Our guards sit reading the same books we do, but without irony. They argue who is stronger, Superman or some other hero. They laugh as if this war does not touch them. I cannot imagine an SS man behaving so. Perhaps that is why they are different." Indeed, the guards' behavior blurred the line between captor and captive. In the shared ritual of passing around comics, there was a strange, almost humanizing bond. The Germans saw not propaganda ministers or ideologues, but ordinary men with ordinary pleasures. They were young, many of them scarcely older than the prisoners themselves, with tastes and distractions that had nothing to do with hate or conquest. Some guards even began lending their own issues directly to prisoners, with a wink and a nod. Others teased the Germans when they tried to hoard a particular issue of Batman, joking, "Don't let him get away, he belongs to me next." This light-hearted banter cut sharply against everything the POWs had been told. It was no act of deliberate indoctrination. The Americans were not trying to convert anyone with comics, yet the effect was profound. It demonstrated to the prisoners that in this strange country, leisure was not restricted, nor was imagination chained. The guards who patrolled with rifles were also the same men who traded pages of pulp adventure, men who embodied both authority and freedom in ways that defied Nazi categories. For the POWs, the realization was disarming. If even the men responsible for their captivity could laugh and dream so freely, then perhaps the foundation of their own world, where power demanded severity and joy was suspect, was hollow at its core. And soon, those comics would do something even more extraordinary. They would begin to teach the German prisoners English. As German prisoners leafed through the brightly colored pages, a debate, both then and now, began to simmer. Were these comic books a form of hidden psychological warfare? At first glance, the idea seems absurd. After all, the Americans did not issue the comics with stern instructions, nor did they lecture the prisoners on their content. The books were often donated or purchased cheaply and tossed into the camp libraries alongside newspapers, novels, and magazines. To the casual observer, it looked like nothing more than a gesture of basic humanity, or perhaps just indifference to what their captives did with their spare time. But in practice, the effect was undeniable. Every panel read, every villain defeated, every joke laughed at, chipped away at the certainties the prisoners had carried across the Atlantic. In a way, it was soft power in its purest form, culture working as a silent weapon. Consider what those comics represented. In Germany, culture had been sterilized. Books were censored, films tightly controlled, radio broadcasts dictated by the Reich Ministry of Propaganda. A German soldier was taught that everything he consumed was political. Every story had to serve the war. Every song had to be loyal. There was no room for triviality. Now imagine that soldier, alone in a wooden barrack in Kansas or Texas, flipping through a comic where the biggest problem was whether Superman could stop a runaway train. No Führer, no speeches, no swastikas. just adventure, fantasy, and laughter. That very absence of ideology was the most subversive thing of all. It suggested a world where stories were not shackled, where entertainment could exist simply to entertain. Some American officials later admitted that they understood this effect, even if it was never formally codified. They knew that the freedom of expression, on display even in comic books, was its own propaganda. Ends, not the kind shouted from loudspeakers, but the kind absorbed slowly, invisibly, until the prisoner could no longer reconcile what he had been told with what he now experienced. For the Germans, the result was often unsettling. Letters and diaries reveal prisoners grappling with the dissonance. One wrote, "If these Americans are so frivolous, how do they feed us so well? If their minds are wasted on jokes, why are their armies so strong? If comics make them weak, why are we here and not them?" It did not matter whether the comics were handed out by accident or design. The psychological impact was the same. They eroded the authority of Nazi propaganda without a single rifle fired, without a single lecture given. And this was the quiet genius of it. America did not need to intend comics as a weapon for them to function like one. A nation confident enough to laugh in the midst of war revealed its strength far more effectively than any leaflet or broadcast could. The prisoners could not escape the conclusion that they were fighting an enemy whose power came not just from industry and soldiers, but from imagination itself. This was psychological warfare, not of force, but of freedom. And it was only beginning to leave its mark on the men who experienced it. The arrival of comic books in POW camps did not produce a uniform response. Instead, it opened a cultural fault line between generations of captured Germans, a fault line that revealed how uneven Nazi indoctrination truly was. Older officers, many of them men who had served in the Reichswehr before Hitler's rise, looked upon the comics with contempt. To their eyes, the brightly inked pages were juvenile nonsense. They sneered at the idea that any serious man would waste his time on such frivolity. One Luftwaffe officer reportedly scoffed, "This is what the Americans call literature? No wonder their society is weak." For these men, steeped in old-world military tradition, the comic book was not just trivial. It was symbolic of the very decadence Nazi propaganda had always promised them America embodied. And yet their dismissals carried little weight among the younger ranks, the conscripts, the farm boys, the students pulled from schools in 1943 and 1944 to fill Hitler's armies. For them, the comics were an irresistible escape. They devoured issue after issue, their eyes wide as Superman lifted tanks, as Batman prowled through alleys, as cowboys galloped across frontier plains. These young soldiers, barely more than boys themselves, found something intoxicating in the colors, the humor, the fantasy. What made this divide even more telling was that both groups believed they were correct. The older men clung to the dignity of their scorn, reinforcing their identity as disciplined officers, guardians of German tradition. The younger ones, though, increasingly saw their elders as relics, out of touch, blind to the fascination that the new world of American culture presented. In this generational tension, cracks in Nazi indoctrination began to widen. The regime had tried to mold all Germans into a single block of loyal soldiers, united in thought and purpose. But in the POW camp, the differences emerged starkly. The old men repeated the rhetoric of contempt, while the younger men, unshackled from the immediate reach of party authority, allowed themselves to question, to laugh, even to admire what they once thought foolish. One camp report noted that junior enlisted prisoners often traded comics in secret, fearful that their officers would punish them for indulging in American poison. In one Texas camp, a prisoner later recalled, "Our captain mocked us, saying no man of honor should waste time on children's books, but we could not help it. We wanted to know if Captain America would win." That quiet admission carried more danger for Nazi ideology than any Allied interrogation could. The very act of younger prisoners enjoying comics became an act of rebellion, small, quiet, but significant. It suggested that the Reich's grip on their imagination was not absolute. In the safety of the American camps, where the Gestapo could not reach, the younger generation allowed themselves to be curious. The officers' sneers, in fact, often backfired. By dismissing what their men found joy in, they only highlighted their own rigidity. Instead of reinforcing discipline, their scorn isolated them. Many younger prisoners began to see their captors, the Americans, as more approachable, even relatable, than their own commanders. In those barracks, divided between sneers and laughter, between scorn and fascination, the quiet war of ideas was being fought. And in many cases, the colorful pages of comic books were winning. For many German prisoners of war, the first obstacle in approaching American comic books was obvious: language. Few of them spoke more than basic English when they arrived in the United States. The text-heavy newspapers were impossible to decipher without assistance. Even simple camp notices had to be translated by those who knew a handful of words. And yet, the comics found their way into eager hands despite this barrier. For these men, words were not the primary lure. The images were. The beauty of the comic form lay in its clarity. A bright shield raised against a villain in a swastika. A man in a cape swooping down from the sky to save a family in peril. A grinning cowboy riding across the desert sun, revolver at his hip. These images required no translation. Even without dialogue, the storylines leapt from the page. In fact, the very structure of comics made them uniquely suited for this kind of cross-cultural encounter. Motion, expression, conflict, and resolution were conveyed visually. A POW could follow the arc of a fight, the triumph of good, the downfall of evil, simply by watching the flow of panels. And in those panels, America's moral imagination was laid bare. Villains were often cloaked in symbols that resonated far beyond borders: jackboots, armbands, menacing banners. Heroes, by contrast, stood for ideals that transcended language: courage, strength, humor, justice. For Germans raised in a society where every story was crafted to serve the Reich, the comics delivered a startlingly direct message. Here was a culture confident enough to caricature its enemies, to mock tyranny, to promise through art that oppression could and would be defeated. Prisoners described how quickly they could grasp meaning without needing a dictionary. One remembered, "The man in the cape fought the man with the crooked cross. I could not read the words, but I knew who would win." Another POW noted that, unlike German publications, the comics were not obsessed with speeches or ideology. They were simple, visual, immediate. And over time, the comics did more than entertain. They became a language tool. Younger prisoners especially began matching words to images, learning fragments of English through repetition. Bang, crash, help. Simple words became embedded in memory, carried back to the barracks where they were whispered, practiced, and repeated. Some POWs later admitted that their first English phrases came not from camp teachers, but from the speech bubbles of superheroes. The irony was rich. A medium dismissed by German officers as childish was, in fact, breaking down the language wall between captors and captives. It was teaching prisoners not only how to laugh at American humor, but also how to understand it. And with understanding came something even more dangerous to Nazi indoctrination: empathy. The POWs might not grasp every nuance, but they could feel the pulse of the stories. They could see that in America's imagination, tyranny was mocked, justice was inevitable, and even the most powerless could be heroes. Life in captivity was defined not by violence or cruelty, but by monotony. Day after day, stretched into sameness, roll call, meals, small chores, the endless passing of hours behind fences and guard towers. For German POWs in America, boredom became the true adversary. It gnawed at morale, eroded pride, and left men vulnerable to thoughts they would never have allowed themselves on the battlefield. And into that emptiness, comics flowed like water into cracks. The prisoners could not work endlessly. They could not train. They could not march. They could not plan offensives. Most of the time they simply waited for news of the war for letters from home, for the distant day of release. The stillness of captivity was suffocating, and so when a stack of colorful magazines appeared in the camp library, it was almost inevitable that men would reach for them. At first, the attraction was simple: distraction. A bright cover of a costumed hero was preferable to staring at the barrack wall. A cowboy chasing bandits offered a flicker of movement in otherwise stagnant days. In those long hours, even the officers who sneered at childish stories sometimes found themselves flipping through a few pages when no one was watching. But distraction has a hidden power. The more often prisoners turned to comics to escape boredom, the more deeply those stories began to seep into their minds. It was not a sudden conversion, not an overnight revelation. It was slow, cumulative, like water dripping on stone. The Reich had built its belief system on certainty, that Germans were destined to rule, that the enemy was weak, that the war was righteous. But boredom eroded certainty. In the empty silence of camp life, doubts had space to grow, and comics fed those doubts with quiet persistence. They offered a competing rhythm, a different worldview. In their pages, good triumphed not through brutality, but through ingenuity, courage, and perseverance. Villains, often cloaked in imagery that resembled the Axis, were defeated with finality. The message was not shouted, it was implied, repeated, lived through countless stories. Prisoners might insist aloud that they did not take it seriously. They might laugh off the adventures as nonsense. Yet day after day they read. The same heroes appeared again and again, reinforcing themes of freedom, resilience, and justice. And whether they admitted it or not, the repetition chipped away at the armor of Nazi ideology. One POW later reflected, "We were bored, and so we read. At first it was nothing, but over months I began to feel strange. The Americans seemed so confident, so free, even in their stories. I wondered if perhaps we had been wrong." It was boredom that opened the door, and once opened, the steady drip of American culture, bright, brash, unapologetic, did its work. What Nazi propaganda had welded together in youth rallies and Hitler youth camps began to loosen, not under interrogation, but under the casual weight of comic books read in idle hours. In the quiet war of ideas, boredom was the great equalizer, and comics were the weapon that filled the silence. For German POWs, the comic book was never just paper and ink. Over time, it came to symbolize something far larger, something that spoke directly to the heart of what separated their world from the world outside the barbed wire. In Germany, every story had been filtered, every word scrutinized. There was no free press, no silly distractions untouched by ideology. Even entertainment was stripped of innocence and pressed into service of the Reich. Songs were censored, films remade, novels burned. And comics? They had been dismissed outright as dangerous, corrupting, unworthy of German youth. To consume them would have been to risk suspicion of weakness, of disloyalty, even of treason. But in America, the forbidden lay scattered casually across barrack tables. Bright covers featuring costumed heroes, gun-slinging cowboys, or outlandish detectives were available to anyone who wanted them, even to prisoners who, by every measure, were supposed to be America's enemies. No permission slips, no lectures, no propaganda minister hovering over their shoulders. This casual abundance was itself a lesson. It revealed a society that trusted its people, even its captives, to read what they pleased. Freedom was not declared in speeches inside those camps, it was demonstrated in ink and paper. The Germans could see it, hold it, turn its pages, and that sensory reality was undeniable. To many prisoners, the realization was startling. They had been told that freedom was chaos, that too much choice led to collapse. Yet here they were, surrounded by stacks of art and storytelling produced without fear, and the society that produced it was not collapsing. It was thriving. One POW later recalled, "In Germany, they told us comics were poison. Here the guards give them freely, even to us. If they feared corruption, why would they allow it? If their stories are weak, "Why are we the prisoners, not Tia? Hem?" That contrast was sharper than any propaganda battle. America did not need to shout about its freedoms, it displayed them in the most ordinary of ways. To let an enemy soldier, trained to hate and destroy, laugh at a comic book was to reveal absolute confidence. A system that allowed even its prisoners to touch forbidden art was stronger than one that denied its citizens the right to read. For the Germans, it was a silent but devastating demonstration. Freedom was not an abstract slogan. It was a lived reality, one they could feel in their hands. In every panel of Superman or Captain America, they saw not just heroes in costume, but a culture unshackled, unafraid, and unapologetically alive. And as the months wore on, that lesson would deepen. Because comics were not just entertainment. They became windows into America itself. Its humor, its anxieties, its dreams, its flaws. Not every German prisoner embraced the comics with curiosity or delight. For some, the very presence of these brightly colored distractions sparked a profound sense of humiliation. Here they were, soldiers of the mighty Wehrmacht, veterans of campaigns across Europe and North Africa, facing defeat not just on the battlefield, but in the realm of culture itself. And their conquerors? They laughed, they played, they read. They were winning, in part, with capes and ink and paper. One diary entry captures this frustration perfectly. "We are losing a war to people who read this childish nonsense. How can a nation survive on laughter and silly pictures?" For these prisoners, the comics were not merely entertainment. They were a mirror reflecting the failure of everything they had been taught to value. Discipline, obedience, and strict adherence to ideology suddenly seemed less important than humor, creativity, and the audacity to imagine beyond reality. This resentment often coexisted with admiration. Even the most indoctrinated soldiers could not deny the effectiveness of the comics as a cultural tool. They were entertaining, yes, but they were also powerful. They revealed flaws in Nazi doctrine, illustrated weaknesses in the mental structures built by years of propaganda. And that was a bitter pill to swallow. Some officers doubled down on their scorn, using the comics as a way to reinforce hierarchy within the camps. They would chastise younger soldiers for reading, deride the stories as foolish, and claim superiority in judgment and taste. Yet even in these moments, cracks showed. Young conscripts laughed secretly, trading issues under the blankets, whispering about heroes and villains in English they were only beginning to understand. The conflict within the prisoners mirrored the larger collapse of Nazi ideology. On the surface, many tried to cling to pride, to assert the superiority of German culture and discipline. But underneath, the bright panels, heroic feats, and humorous antics of American comics planted seeds of doubt. Could a culture so playful, so imaginative, be defeated so decisively? Were these enemies really inferior? Or had the Reich blinded them to a different kind of strength? The bitterness was personal as well as ideological. POWs who had survived harrowing campaigns and endured deprivation now found themselves humbled in a most unexpected way. The war had reduced them to spectators, and yet the comics had reduced them further, to children peering in wonder at stories they had been forbidden to know. For some, the effect was subtle, frustration mixed with begrudging respect. For others, it was corrosive, eroding confidence and self-image. The humor, the absurdity, the very joy embedded in the American comics became a silent weapon, targeting not the body, but the psyche. And in that quiet psychological pressure, the Americans revealed something the prisoners could not openly acknowledge. Power did not always roar. Sometimes it laughed, sometimes it smiled from the pages of a comic, and the impact was just as real. The influence of comics in the POW camps did not remain confined to passive reading. For some prisoners, it sparked creativity, a desire to emulate what they had discovered on the printed page. Within weeks, crude sketches began to appear on scraps of paper, inside notebooks, even on the backs of ration cards. These were not works intended for publication or approval. They were personal, often humorous, and occasionally biting. Soldiers who had never held a pencil for entertainment began drawing their own versions of what they saw. Exaggerated caricatures of guards, self-made comic strips depicting everyday life in the camp, and satirical reinterpretations of their own comrades' experiences. One recurring motif was the gentle mockery of authority. American guards appeared in panels with oversized rifles or comic expressions, chasing prisoners in slapstick chases rather than scenes of fear or discipline. These drawings allowed POWs to reclaim a sense of control, if only on paper. In the act of creating, they inverted the hierarchy they could not change in reality. The caped heroes they admired became templates for their own storytelling, a visual language that both entertained and subtly resisted the imposed order. The process was immediate and visible. Barracks walls became galleries of makeshift cartoons, and soon entire barracks were sharing their sketches with neighbors. Older officers often scowled at the childishness, reinforcing generational divides, but younger prisoners enthusiastically traded drawings alongside borrowed comics. Some even attempted to replicate the storytelling techniques: panel sequences, speech bubbles, exaggerated motion lines, the works. The effect went beyond amusement. By producing their own comics, POWs were internalizing the lessons of the originals. They absorbed the moral clarity, the humor, the courage, and the ingenuity of the Americans. Heroes. Their sketches revealed not only artistic imitation, but an evolving mindset, playful, questioning, and more willing to see the world outside rigid ideology. A former prisoner recalled years later, "I had never drawn in my life, but I found myself sketching, laughing at the absurdities around us. Comics showed me that imagination could be more powerful than fear." These creations were personal acts of rebellion and self-expression, tiny testaments to the subtle psychological impact of the comics. In essence, the influence was twofold. The original American comics educated and entertained, while the prisoner's own art demonstrated how ideas could take root and transform thought. A medium that had begun as a simple distraction had become a conduit for creativity, reflection, and quiet resistance. The camps, once spaces of monotony and confinement, now contained a dynamic visual culture. The power of imagination, once forbidden, was flourishing behind barbed wire, and the seeds of change were visible for all who looked closely. The impact of comics on German POWs extended beyond the fences of the camps. On rare, supervised trips to nearby towns, medical visits, labor details, or work parties, prisoners caught glimpses of a world they had only previously imagined, and what they saw reinforced the lessons learned inside the wire. Children and teenagers were everywhere, clutching the same comic books the prisoners had devoured in their barracks. On street corners, in store windows, and in homes glimpsed during guarded excursions, superheroes, cowboys, and detectives leapt from page to eager hands. The stories were not restricted to elite circles, nor hidden from public view. They were omnipresent, part of everyday life, and unmistakably mainstream. For the POWs, this realization was shocking. They had assumed that the comics were a minor diversion, perhaps an accidental indulgence by camp authorities. But now they could see the same images thriving openly in American society, unpoliced, unguarded, and celebrated by children across the nation. What they had thought might be a subtle psychological tactic inside the camp was in fact a reflection of a society confident enough to allow culture to flourish freely, without fear, even in the presence of enemy soldiers. Letters and diary entries from the period describe the astonishment. One POW noted, "We thought perhaps they showed us these books to make us laugh or to keep us busy, but outside, the children read the same. It was everywhere. They do not hide their culture. They live it openly." Another remarked on the bold colors, the laughter, the vitality of the American youth. "It seemed almost impossible," he wrote, "that a nation could allow such freedom, and yet still wield power." This contrast struck even harder because it emphasized a fundamental difference between regimes. In Germany, the state controlled what children read, what they watched, what they thought. In America, even its youngest citizens were allowed the liberty to explore stories for joy, and the same society could simultaneously prosecute a war with efficiency and resolve. Freedom and strength coexisted in ways that the German soldiers had never seen firsthand. In many ways, the sight of children reading comics crystallized the lesson of captivity. It was not a trick or a trap. It was a living demonstration of a national ethos. Here was a culture confident enough to share its imagination with anyone, even those who had fought against it. And by extension, it revealed the scale of trust and moral self-assurance that lay at the heart of the American war effort. For the POWs, these fleeting excursions into American towns were more than curiosities. They were visual proof of a society that embraced creativity, leisure, and freedom as inseparable from strength. And each return to the camp carried that lesson back behind the barbed wire, deepening the impression left by the comic books themselves. As the prisoners grew more familiar with American comics, a deeper understanding began to emerge. Beyond the bright colors, the capes, and the battles, the comics symbolized something far more profound: the democratic nature of culture itself. Unlike the tightly regimented media of the Third Reich, these stories were created not by the state, but by individuals, for the enjoyment of the public. In Germany, every narrative had been scrutinized, every song and every story vetted to ensure compliance with ideology. Books were burned, newspapers censored, movies inspected. Art and entertainment were instruments of control, designed to reinforce hierarchy, obedience, and loyalty to the state. The individual had no authority in culture. Creativity was subordinate to ideology. In America, the comics told a different story. Writers, illustrators, and publishers created with freedom, and the audience, children, adults, even prisoners, decided what mattered. Ideas were evaluated by popularity, by the joy they inspired, and by the resonance of the hero's actions. Authority did not dictate taste. The public did. For POWs who had been taught that culture belonged to the state, this bottom-up model was revolutionary. They began to see that the vibrancy of American society, even amid war, stemmed from a fundamental trust in its people. Superman, Batman, Captain America, they were not symbols imposed by propaganda ministers. They were inventions born of imagination and commerce, freely shared, freely enjoyed, and freely interpreted. Some prisoners were struck by the contrast on a personal level. One soldier, in a letter home, admitted, "In Germany, nothing was allowed without permission. Here, the stories belong to everyone. Even we, who are enemies, may read and enjoy them. I do not know if I envy or resent it." The acknowledgement was tinged with awe and frustration. The simplicity of the act, reading, imagining, enjoying, highlighted a freedom that had been systematically denied to them. And yet, the symbolism ran deeper. Comics suggested that a society could trust its citizens with ideas, laughter, and even dissent, without losing cohesion. The POWs were witnessing the practical manifestation of a system far removed from the authoritarian order they had fought to uphold. A society where freedom of thought and creation did not weaken the state, but strengthened it. Even small details reinforced this lesson. The range of stories, from humorous adventures to heroic sagas, reflected the multiplicity of voices in American culture. No central authority dictated themes or morals. Villains were mocked, heroes celebrated, and the moral lessons were implicit rather than enforced. Freedom, the prisoners realized, was not abstract. It was lived every time a comic book changed hands. This realization unsettled many. For decades, they had internalized the belief that only strict control could produce order. Now, the opposite appeared true. Creativity, humor, and imagination were not weaknesses. They were a sign of vitality. And it was all laid bare in the pages of a comic book, quietly undermining the ideological pillars they had carried across Europe. The influence of American comics extended far beyond the confines of barbed wire and wooden barracks. For many German POWs, the stories they read, the panels they studied, and the humor they absorbed left lasting impressions, echoes that persisted long after they returned home. When the war ended and prisoners were repatriated to a shattered Germany, the physical scars of battle were accompanied by psychological shifts that had begun in captivity. In diaries, memoirs, and post-war interviews, former POWs often recalled the simple pleasure of comics, not merely as a form of entertainment, but as a lens through which they first understood a freer, more dynamic society. Some admitted that those colorful pages had fundamentally altered their perception of the enemy. They had arrived in America with the indoctrinated certainty that the United States was weak, morally decadent, and incapable of meaningful strength. Yet in the camps, they witnessed not only discipline and order, but also creativity, humor, and generosity. Comics, in their unassuming way, made that contrast tangible. A former prisoner reflected decades later, "I never thought I would say this, but those comic books showed me a country alive in a way I had never imagined. They laughed, they dreamed, they created heroes for their children, and even for us. I left the camp thinking differently about America than I ever would have if I had only seen the soldiers." The effect was subtle, but pervasive. POWs carried those memories into civilian life. For some, it fostered curiosity and admiration for American culture. For others, it created a quiet acknowledgement that the rigid, monochrome worldview they had been taught was incomplete. In a way, comics had planted seeds of understanding, empathy, and even cultural respect, sown behind fences and watchtowers in the unlikeliest of classrooms. Beyond individual reflection, there were practical consequences. Some former POWs, influenced by these early encounters, engaged with American literature, films, and pop culture after returning home. They shared stories of superheroes and adventures with their children, bridging a cultural gap in the post-war years. The small act of reading a comic in captivity had, in many cases, evolved into a lifelong awareness of a society built on imagination, freedom, and shared creativity. It is striking to consider that in the midst of global conflict, behind a fence in the American heartland, a medium as simple as a comic book could plant such enduring impressions. The bright colors, dramatic narratives, and humor did more than pass time. They became symbols of an alternative worldview, quietly shaping minds that had once been hardened by ideology. In the broader story of the war, this influence might seem minor, almost trivial, yet for those who experienced it, it mattered. Comics were not just stories, they were the first threads of a bridge between two worlds, and the first hints that even enemies could find common ground in imagination and narrative. For decades, the story of POWs has often been framed in terms of logistics, escapes, and interrogations. But the quieter, subtler experiences, the daily interactions with culture, the small acts that chipped away at prejudice, reveal a different layer of history. Among these, the comic books handed to German prisoners stand out as an extraordinary example of soft power in action. The prisoners arrived expecting confinement, hostility, and perhaps humiliation. Instead, they were given access to a form of expression and imagination that, in their own country, would have been forbidden or censored. Comics, so often dismissed as trivial, became conduits for a deeper understanding of America's character. They conveyed humor, creativity, and moral clarity, all without a single directive or decree. These small windows into American life allowed POWs to see a society that thrived on freedom rather than strict control, that celebrated imagination alongside discipline, and that trusted its citizens, even its enemies, with access to culture. For men who had been trained to believe that the Reich was the pinnacle of order and morality, these stories were revelatory. They illuminated a world where joy and strength could coexist, where morality was not imposed but illustrated, and where freedom was tangible enough to hold in one's hands. Historians and cultural analysts now recognize that such exposure had profound implications. It was a form of cultural diplomacy, accidental or deliberate, that challenged the indoctrinated minds of the prisoners. Beyond the immediate effect of entertainment, comics subtly undermined confidence in Nazi narratives and introduced ideas of freedom, creativity, and resilience that could not be contained by ideology alone. The legacy of this experience persisted long after the war ended. Former POWs carried memories of these stories back to Germany, sharing them with friends, family, and, in some cases, children. They remembered the contrast between censorship and abundance, rigidity and play, fear and freedom. In a world recovering from totalitarianism, these small experiences helped shape post-war perceptions of America, contributing to admiration, curiosity, and even reconciliation. In the end, the story of comics in POW camps is more than a curious anecdote. It is a reminder that culture can be as potent a force as armies and weapons, and that imagination, bright, colorful, and seemingly simple, can leave an imprint that outlasts battlefields and borders. German POWs came to America expecting chains. Instead, they were given comics, small, colorful windows into a society they had been told was weak. What they found instead was a culture brimming with imagination, confidence, and freedom. And through those simple pages, the prisoners glimpsed a world that challenged what they had always believed, leaving a quiet, indelible mark on history. Subscribe for more forgotten WWII stories and witness how the smallest acts can leave the deepest impressions. The enemy was supposed to break them with force. Armed guards, fences, and the threat of punishment were meant to keep fear and discipline at the center of every day. And yet, in the quiet corners of the camps, something entirely unexpected occurred. America didn't need to shout, threaten, or impose. It simply handed its captives comic books. The simplest stories, heroes in capes, cowboys in dusty towns, villains vanquished with wit and courage, had the deepest impact. They carried lessons the prisoners could not ignore, even if they tried. Freedom, imagination, moral clarity, and a society confident enough to let even enemies share in its culture. What the Wehrmacht had built through years of indoctrination began to unravel, not through interrogation or violence, but through laughter, color, and story. It was subtle, powerful, and undeniable. Comics became instruments of perspective, windows into a world the prisoners had been taught to fear and despise. And in those moments, behind barbed wire, the prisoners glimpsed an America far stronger than any propaganda had admitted. But the story doesn't end with ink and paper. Comics were only the first shock. The Americans had other surprises waiting, simple yet startling, that challenged everything the POWs thought they knew about life, society, and power. Subscribe for more forgotten WWII stories and prepare for the next shocking revelation. In our next episode, discover why German prisoners said the food in American camps was better than anything they had eaten back home. The war was fought on battlefields, but sometimes the battles that changed minds were fought over the smallest things.